All right, gang. So yesterday we talked about the causes of World War I and the early division of our breaking up of the different sides. And today we're going to talk about the first round of fighting, the major significance of it, and the U.S. entry into World War I. Well, so belligerents is a term that means people who are fighting. And so there are two basic sides in World War I, as we talked about. Well, there are the Central Powers, or the group becoming known as the Central Powers. That's Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, mostly because they're called that because they are at the center of Europe, and therefore they're in the middle. Well, everyone else that is against them is essentially called the Allied powers. Those are the allies that are aligned against them. So Britain, France, Russia, Japan, eventually the U.S., Italy is an allied power. Brazil provides support for the allied powers. So those are all groups of the allied powers. So those are all fighting against each other. Now, we've talked about World War I as being the first world war, truly global war. But it is also the first large-scale industrialized war. And it's also what's known as a total war. It is industrialized because it is the first major use of machines in warfare. Now, the American Civil War and other engagements and other fighting saw a lot of use of machines. But this is the very first time that machines are one of the primary modes of attacking and one of the primary modes of weaponry. Okay, it is also total war, meaning that all of society is motivated toward the end of winning the war. Total war means that all of society is involved. Your entire country is involved in some way or another. In earlier wars, and even I would argue that the war that the U.S. is in with Afghanistan right now, is it doesn't affect us directly right now. Okay, unless you're a soldier or a soldier's family, it doesn't affect you. And so, but a total war is very different. Total war means that everyone has to cut back on what they're eating, cut back on the things that they're using in order to help the country successfully wage the war. So that's what that means. So here are a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. One, machine guns. We talked about the Maxim gun being used to help colonize Africa. Well, the machine guns are now being applied to and are now being used at war in Europe. And so the machine guns play a tremendous role in forcing them to use trenches. Okay, we're going to have an illustration of this in class, but trench warfare developed because of machine guns. Because if you think about it, if you're marching straight in line against a machine gun, your entire troops are going to get mowed down. And so you have to change your level or lower to do that. And so the digging of trenches became a necessity in order to do that. Tanks. Tanks initially grew out of the idea that they were going to mount machine guns on motorcycles and ride motorcycles around with machine guns on them. Well, tanks grew out of that idea. Tanks were originally developed by the British and then later by the Germans as these just basically mobile boats, naval warfare on boats. And in fact, interesting fact that I just found out was that the first drivers of tanks were from the upper class because they were the only ones who had enough money to pay for cars. Okay, so I think that's interesting. So the upper class were the tank drivers because those were the ones familiar with driving cars. So tanks made their first introduction into warfare here. Gas and chemical weapons. Mustard gas is a nerve agent that was being used on the troops of both sides. Both German and Allied soldiers were subject to mustard gas attacks. Now, mustard gas in chemical warfare is a very dangerous thing. It can burn your skin and cause a lot of damage to you. And so that was one of the reasons that people used it, was because they were trying to win by any means necessary, regardless of the method. And so now we're seeing machines applied to men. We're seeing machines used to kill men on a massive scale. And we're seeing all the scientific advancement and scientific knowledge now being applied to harm people for kind of the first time. Well, the Battle of the Somme was a battle that took place in northeastern France and Belgium. And it is a battle that lasted from July of 1916 to November of 1916. So basically, we've got a battle that lasts 5 months. And this is an excellent example of the industrialized war and the basic futility or uselessness or difficulty of gaining ground on it, because the troops dug holes in the ground for their trenches and they fought, and there was no advancement as we've seen in other wars. There was no retreat as we've seen in other wars. It was basically just simply killing each other, replacing those troops, sending in more troops, killing more. And it showed that war had really ground down and really slowed things down, and that now warfare was very different than it had been in the 19th and 18th centuries. Well, on the home front, at home, governments began to use propaganda to help them illustrate their points. What they were trying to do is they were trying to stir up feelings of nationalism so that their people did not get tired of the war. And that's really important because propaganda was used to make sure that those nationalistic feelings were kept. The Germans used propaganda, the British, even the Americans used propaganda to make sure that their people still supported the war. Now, the timing of the pictures is not great, but we can see here are U-boats, which I'll talk about in a second. You see machine guns mounted on the top of trenches. And here's an example of British propaganda. Women saying to their British men, go fight for us, defend our honor, protect our country, and gain land for the pride of our country. Well, one last example of a tremendous technological advancement in World War I was the invention of the U-boat, or the Unterseeboten, as the Germans called it, or the submarine. Now, submarines are really great for warfare and naval warfare, because prior to sonar, you could drop your boat below sea level, you could go, and you could attack unnoticed, completely unnoticed by a ship. And that was really dangerous, and we didn't have the technology to detect that yet. And so that leads to what helps to bring in the Americans into World War I. Again, U-boats were a German advancement. They used them in warfare to create blockades, and it really caused a lot of problems and made people very scared to travel by boat. Well, the U.S. had initially declared their neutrality in World War I, and they had said, you know what, we're going to stay out of it. The president, Woodrow Wilson, was elected in 1914, and partially because he declared that, 1916, partially declared that he would keep the U.S. out of the First World War. I'll have to check on the years of the war. But anyway, the president said, I will keep us out of war. He was reelected with a promise to keep us out. Well, in 1915, the Germans had sunk a ship called the Lusitania. And in 1916, they used unrestricted sub-warfare, or 1915. Wilson said to them, hey, you guys need to knock that crap off. You need to stop it or we're going to attack. Well, they said, okay, they'd stop. Americans were really unhappy. They sunk a couple more ships, but they stopped in 1915. Well, as time went on, though, the Germans realized that they were losing the war, and they sent a telegram to Mexico, and this telegram is called the Zimmerman telegram. And essentially what this declared was the Germans messaged Mexico and said, hey, Mexico, join the war on our side. Join the Central Powers, and here's what we're going to do. We are about to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. So we're going to start this back. And if we start this, the Americans are going to jump back into war. So here's what we need you to do, Mexico. Mexico, you need to attack the American Southwest. You need to take back the land that you lost to the Americans in the Mexican-American War. And that was the promise, is that if Mexico joins the war on the side of Germany, Germany will give them support and they will help them gain land back from the U.S. Well, Britain intercepted it, just like the Germans intercepted the Ems telegram to help them declare war on France to create the German country. The British intercepted the Zimmerman telegram in order to bring the U.S. in on the war side of them. So the British intercepted it, they published it in newspapers, and Americans went berserk. They were terribly unhappy about this. And finally, Woodrow Wilson was like, you know what, we got to enter the war at this point. This is coming too close to our doorstep. So America declared war on April 6, 1917. Now, the war is almost over at this point. The war, in fact, does not last a whole lot longer, and the war actually ends very soon after this. And Americans don't lose a lot of troops, okay? But America enters the war. It turns the tide completely in favor of the Allies, and it is with American help, not because, but with American help, that the Allies are finally able to win. Well, Woodrow Wilson, when he went to make his or ask Congress for their declaration of war, said, you know what, we need to prevent bad things from happening again in our history. We need to prevent this. And so he made a speech, and it's called the Speech on 14 Points. And what he does in the 14-point speech is he essentially breaks down all of the causes of World War I and how the world can prevent that from happening from now on. So let's take a quick look at the 14 points. And tomorrow we're going to categorize these and see where they fall. What cause do they specifically address? So, 1, no more secret agreements. All covenants or promises are going to be openly arrived at. free navigation of the seas. That was a major issue because the Germans had blockaded the ports with their submarines. All economic barriers between countries are over. Free trade for everyone. Countries have to reduce weapons. All decisions regarding colonies should be impartial. Okay, one side should not get favor over the other. Germany is to remove their army from Russia. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Russia to be left to develop her own government. Belgium is going to go back to being independent. France should be fully liberated and given back Alsace and Lorraine, which they had lost during the Franco-Prussian War. All Italians are going to be allowed to live in Italy along clearly lines of nationality. Again, we see nationality as the idea here. Self-determination allowed for Austria-Hungary. Self-determination allowed for the Balkans. Turkish people should govern the Turkish government. Non-Turks in the old Turkish Empire should govern themselves. That's really important and plays a major role in the way the 20th century shapes in the Middle East today. So the Middle East is really important following World War I, and it really shapes what happens today. And independent Poland. Poland had stopped existing from the late 1700s until the end of World War I. So Poland comes back as a country. And finally, and probably the most dramatic impact that Woodrow Wilson has was the suggestion that a League of Nations should be created to help guarantee political and territorial independence of everyone. So basically, all countries are going to get together and talk about their issues on an international scale. So we'll have more tomorrow on this, but that's Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Today we talked about why it was a total war, why it was an industrial war, and what brought the U.S. into that war. Bye.